Today we are continuing straight on from what I was talking about last week. And if you weren't here last week, I'll give you a little bit of context, but feel free to go back online, watch the sermon so you can catch up. But last week, Jesus had all these people coming to him. You know, sick, in need, they're oppressed, they're under spiritual oppression, and he was healing them. And then he appointed his disciples to go out in twos and do the same. Go and heal people, set people free, preach good news to the poor. And then he warned them, you're going to do these incredible things, and there will be some people who turn on you. There'll be some people who don't like this. And if you look through history, we can see this. There have been people who have done incredible things. Martin Luther King, you know, with the civil rights movement, bringing rights to all people, and yet he was killed. And we see that through history. It doesn't matter if you do the best things in the world. If you're the kindest person, there'll be somebody who takes it wrong and puts a spin, and you'll be persecuted. So this is the context that this next passage is being read in, because it's got some confusing bits in it. But this is the context. He sent them out to do good things, and now he's warning them. Not everyone is going to appreciate what you're doing. So this is from the book of Matthew. Students are not greater than their teacher, and slaves are not greater than their master. Students are to be like their teacher, and slaves are to be like their master. And since I, the master of the household, have been called the prince of demons, the members of my household will be called even worse names. But don't be afraid of those who threaten you, for the time is coming where everything that is covered will be revealed, and all that is secret will be made known to all. What I tell you now in the darkness, shout abroad when daylight comes. What I whisper in your ear, shout from the housetops for all to hear. Don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. What is the price of 2 sparrows? 1 copper coin? But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Everyone who acknowledges me publicly here on earth, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But everyone who denies me here on earth, I'll also deny before my Father in heaven. Don't imagine that I came to bring peace on earth. I came not to bring peace but a sword. I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies will be right in your own household. If you love your father or mother more than you love me, you're not worthy of being mine. Or if you love your son and daughter more than me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you refuse to take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you cling to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it. So the context here isn't, Jesus giving hot tips for how to have a dysfunctional family. This is him explaining, you're going to go out into the world, you're going to be preaching good news, you're going to be healing the sick, these incredible things, and it will cause division because some people will turn against you. So here are the disciples, out they go, and he's warning them. Now, in our context, I think this can get a little bit lost because, in Jesus' day, it's the Roman Empire, and for fun, they used to, go to the stadium and watch people get eaten by lions. Whoa, we think rugby's great, we've got nothing. And so he's sort of warning them, you're in this really toxic environment, this evil empire, and there will be people that turn against you. And just get yourself ready. And then, hot tip, don't be afraid. And this is the passage I want to look at today. Jesus is saying, don't be afraid. And is this a sensible instruction? And what sparrows? 1 copper coin, but not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. Now, sometimes when we hear passages like this, and there's many more, cast your burdens on Jesus, I'll be anxious for nothing, I'll trust in God. There's all manner of verses that make it sound like that the job, if you're following Jesus, is to never be afraid. And certainly don't acknowledge your fear, just push it down, get rid of it. And I remember, it would have been a few years ago now, it was on the first anniversary of the mosque shootings, and I'd been invited to a panel, and we were filmed, I think it was a Shine TV or something like that, and there was a whole lot of church leaders, and there was the interview person, and he was from outside of Christchurch, and he was asking us, what was it like, on that day? And what I remembered was all the fake news coming out that the media had latched onto, and I don't know if you remember this. They thought for quite some time that there were 9 shooters. And then one street over from where I was, they were saying that a bomb had been found in a car. And so and we went to bed that night thinking that there were all these gunmen on the loose and it was in our neighbourhood. So I remember going that night, and this is what I said, it was a night of fear because we didn't know. What was on the media was there was all these gunmen running loose. And so I said I remember going into the house and just creeping to the back of the house and kind of huddling together while trying to be brave for our daughter. And there was another church leader, and they looked at me with scorn, and they said, "No, we chose not to give in to fear. There's victory in Jesus, and we were happy in the midst of, we're not going to give in to fear." And here's this thinking that pervades Christian thought sometimes. We don't give in to fear. We're living in victory. But today I want to talk about the example of Jesus, because while he says, "Don't be afraid," he experiences fear and intense fear. And there's quite a lot that we can learn from him. How did he go through fear? How did he go through anxiety? Because anxiety is a real and natural part of the human existence. And it's often beneficial. Back in the day, when people were out hunting, they needed to respond to their fear, because what if a lion came upon them? They needed to be able to run. They needed their adrenaline to beat. And so anxiety is a normal part of the human existence, and actually can be quite helpful if you're in the jungle and you see a tiger. But how do we cope with it now? What do we do? So I want to look at the life of Jesus, in particular the night before he died. And we are told that on the night before he died, and 3 out of the 4 gospel stories retell this story. On the night before he died, Jesus went with his friends to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he cries out to God, "Don't let this thing happen. Take the suffering away from me. Take this cup away from me." He is scared. He knows what is coming, and he's pleading with God. If there's a way out of this, I want to take that way out. He's acknowledging the fear. And in the midst of this, we're told that he sweated blood. Now, I think for a long time people were like, well, that's not possible, is it? But now with, worldwide communication, it's actually known now that this is an unusual but real phenomenon. And I read this on a health website, the American Institutes of Health, National Institute of Health, so reputable source. And they had an article that says this: bloody sweating is called hematohydrosis. It may occur in individuals suffering from extreme levels of stress. Around the sweat glands there are multiple blood vessels in a net-like form which constrict under the pressure of great stress. Then, as the anxiety passes, the blood vessels dilate to the point of rupture and it goes into the sweat glands. As the sweat glands produce a lot of sweat, they push the blood to the surface, which comes out as droplets of blood mixed with sweat. This is Jesus under intense stress and anxiety, knowing what is coming. And he's there in the moment. Now, I think in our culture, we're not sweating blood, but often we fail to recognise when we're anxious. When are we under extreme stress? When is it getting too much? And I think particularly in older generations, I think there's been no teaching around this. Younger generations, we talk about it, we talk about breathing, we talk about mindfulness, but often there's this kind of lack of recognition about what's going on. So what does happen when we are experiencing anxiety. And again, the first thing to note is this is normal. And at some point, everyone will go through this. Lack of sleep, tense muscles, shortness of breath, stomach disorders, rumination, which is when you just can't let go of a thought. It goes round and round, or a scenario. What if this is going to happen? Or you're going back over something that has happened. Avoidance, and then extreme end heart issues like palpitations, and then panic attacks. I am sure you have all experienced some of this at some point. Now, they say a third of all adults will experience quite severe anxiety at some point, bordering on anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. Teenagers, the anxiety rates are really high, and particularly for teenage girls, emotional distress is really, really high. But this is part of being human. Jesus experienced it. We'll all experience it. Today I want to have a look at what someone, Johanna introduced me to this week. A guy called Curtis Chan says about it. Now, Curtis Chan has an interesting story. He was a Harvard graduate, and eventually he becomes a minister in a church pastor. And he's the senior pastor of a big church, and the church is moving locations. They're going through a bit of a theological shift, encouraging people to start serving the poor. And they've just changed from their previous leader. And he said numbers are in freefall. People have stopped attending, they have to lay off staff. And it's this horrible situation. He says he gets to the point where he starts only sleeping 6 hours a night. And then it becomes 5 hours a night. And then it becomes 4 hours a night. And then he said he went into a period of 2 weeks where he barely slept. He says he does not remember falling asleep. There may have been micro sleeps, but no full restful sleep. And he says 10 days in, he just starts screaming. He's in his lounge and he just starts screaming and screaming and screaming. And then he remembers this is what they do to torture people. And then he starts yelling out to God, like, I'll do anything, just take this away from me. Take this cup away, just whatever, make this go away. It doesn't go away. Curtis ends up with, horrendous anxiety that he finally acknowledges. He goes and gets treatment, and he leaves his job because he realises he doesn't have what is needed. It's become overwhelming. And Curtis Chan has written this really good book, The Anxiety Opportunity. But even better, there's about, 10 million, that's an exaggeration clearly, podcasts for Africa with Curtis Chan. It's like wherever, someone does a podcast, I've probably interviewed Curtis Chan. Look at you, Tara, you're like, you shouldn't have said that, and I probably shouldn't have, should I? Oh no, if you're like that. I was just thinking, that phrase, such and such for Africa, that's probably, no, I need to get rid of that. Anyway, so there's a lot of podcasts with Curtis Chan on them, and I've listened to a few this week, and he's got really helpful hints and actually just direction. And the first thing he says, which I think is really helpful, is anxiety is fear of future loss. And if you go back and think of times when you have experienced anxiety, what has caused it? And I look back on my own life, this I think is true. Anxiety is a fear of future loss. And that's why we ruminate, we go over and over and over it. And he makes the point, we cannot avoid loss, so we cannot avoid anxiety. This is to be human. To be human is to experience loss, and so to be human is to experience the anxiety that comes with it. And Curtis Chan makes this point. The trap spiritually is to think that the answer is some scenario in the future, guaranteed by God, where we will not experience loss. And this is where we start praying to God to give me a future where we will not experience loss. He also comments, there's nothing wrong with this. This is what Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. But if we start insisting that the only solution is the avoidance of that future loss, then we become trapped. I think this is what has happened often in churches where it's like, if only you have enough faith, God will give you what you want. It sort of turns into this strange, almost other religion. This isn't the story of Scripture, and it's not the example of Jesus, who experienced huge loss, the ultimate loss through death. What Curtis Chan is saying here is very similar to one of the best known therapies for anxiety, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. Just a little bit of an explanation what this is. In acceptance and commitment therapy, clients learn to stop avoiding, denying and struggling with their inner emotions and instead accept that these deeper feelings are appropriate responses to certain situations that should not prevent them from moving forward in their lives. With this understanding, clients begin to accept their hardships and commit to making necessary changes in their behaviour regardless of what is going on in their lives and how they feel about it. This is a quote from the psychologist who developed this therapy. We as a culture seem to be dedicated to the idea that negative human emotions need to be fixed, managed or changed, not experienced as a part of a whole life. We are treating our own lives as problems to be solved, as if we can sort through our experience for the ones we like and throw out the rest. This is, I think, Western way of operating. We only need to be happy. I was talking to some people after the 9 o'clock service. We're talking about in funerals, how in Western culture no one cries in funerals, no one displays any emotion. We just want to get rid of the horrible ones. And then also when you go and visit someone who's just lost someone, people come in, how are you going? In other cultures, you go and you sit and you weep with someone in their distress. And so this is the pattern that we can often find ourselves in our culture. Curtis Chan advocates this phrase, move from avoidance to holding. Don't try and avoid the anxiety. Don't try and avoid the grief. Don't try and avoid the distress. Hold it. Be present with those negative emotions. And he looks at Jesus' life and example, and he comes up with 3 pointers that Jesus did where he holds these emotions. And the first one, these practices, the first thing Jesus does is he prays. And in the prayer in Gethsemane, he asks for avoidance because that's normal. God, I don't want this to happen for me. But ultimately, Jesus prays that God's will be done. He acknowledges that God is still in control, even though it can turn out not the way we want. Another thing Curtis Chan doesn't note, but I've added, is that Jesus prays for others in the midst of his distress. Jesus prays for the disciples. Jesus prays that God would protect the disciples and hold them. When Eliza was born, and some of you have heard this story, I ended up in the mothers and babies ward for 6 weeks with immense emotional distress. Like I had lost my ability to regulate sleep, emotions, the lot. I was a mess. But one thing that I did each night, as I started getting a bit better, was this practice of praying for peace for the people in the ward. And I'd think of all the people, name them, and pray for God's peace for them. And I'd pray for the rest of the hospital. Then I'd pray for the suburb. And then I'd pray for the city. Then I'd pray for the country. Then I'd pray for the world. And then the other thing I did is in my ward, I was surrounded by baby things. And almost every single thing was gifted to me by someone else. And then I'd pray for those people by name. The person who gave me that book, the person who gave me that onesie, the person who knitted that blanket. And here is a practice that we don't need to wait until we're under emotional distress to start doing. And this is what Curtis Chan actually advocates. Start these practices when you're well. He talks, and one of the interviewers is talking to him about someone saying, I am too distressed to even pray at the moment. All I want to do is binge watch Netflix. And he replies, it's like, that's fine. Just tell God that. God, I'm too distressed to pray right now. All I want to do is binge watch Netflix, and these are the shows I'm going to watch. Amen. And it's like, this is praying. This is prayer. Just Remind yourself in the good times and the bad, you can talk to God and tell him what is happening. The second thing that Jesus does is he grieves. He doesn't avoid pain. And we see that when he goes to visit Lazarus. He grieves for his friend and he grieves over Jerusalem. He is sad and he sits in his grief. And here Curtis Chan says, don't avoid pain, experience it and sit with it. So this is a message to Hamilton today. Grieve your pain and your loss while we celebrate our win again. But sit in your pain and your sorrow. Here is the advice. Sit in your pain. And Jesus didn't try and avoid grief. And then the third thing Jesus did is he had community around him. And as he is in the Garden of Gethsemane praying, he goes and gets his friends. Now, he has built up relationship with them over 3 years in good times. But now he goes and gets with them. Sit with me. Stay with me. Like, this is the worst night of my life. Stay with me. Now, the disciples aren't great. They fall asleep. They don't realise quite what's coming. But Jesus has these good relationships, these deep relationships. And so he asks his friends. And so here is something that we can learn from. Do we have a community of people that we can go deep with, that we can be honest with, that are there for us in the good times and will be there for us in the bad times? Do we have a community that we can be truly honest with? And so here is the challenge. Here is the challenge for when we are facing mental distress. To pray, to grieve, and to draw on our community. It's one beautiful image I came across this week, and it talks about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think this is worth remembering, that while Jesus is going through the distress, an angel comes and supports him. And certainly this has been my experience, that in the midst of the darkest times of my life, God has come in a more real way than he ever has in the times when I have been well. It didn't start off like that, and it's kind of at the bottom of the barrel when you get there. But there is this one promise in Scripture. There isn't a promise that everything's going to be rosy, that you're not going to experience loss, that it's always going to be victorious. The one promise is that God will never leave us, that God will be there in the midst of it. And I think when you're in the worst part of distress, you cannot feel that anymore. That's where you just have to know. And again, these practices, reminding yourself in the good times, God is there, will help in the worst times. Story in the Bible in the Old Testament of Elijah. And he has taken on, like the disciples will, an evil empire. And he has, called them out. And he has called on God, demonstrate your power to these people. And God has turned up a display of God's power, runs away into the desert and hides and crawls under a bush and he prays, God, I want to die. This is miserable. I don't want to live anymore. My ancestors are better off dead and in the ground. Take me now. He is in mental anguish and mental distress. And then an angel comes and gives him bread. And I think there is beauty in remembering the gifts that God gives us to sustain us and to help us. And one of the very simple things that God gives us is food. And I think when you're in the midst of emotional distress, you forget to eat. It's too hard to eat. And yet here is God calling us. And I think the story of Curtis Chan, I don't care what you're doing. I don't care how important you might think you are. You need to eat and you need to sleep. Those are my gifts to you, to eat and to sleep. I think sometimes we need to be reminded that we're not so important, that we don't need to eat and sleep. And we're not so above the rest of the world that we won't experience loss and grief and anxiety. And in the midst of that, We're called to remember God's provision to us even when we don't feel it. To eat, to sleep, to pray, to grieve, and to call on our friends, to call on community. I think there is a humbling aspect in all of this. I think in our culture we like to be in control, we like to have power. And when we finally get to these moments of distress and anxiety, we realise we don't. We are just another creature. And yet here's this invitation. Jesus, Son of God, Creator of the whole universe, allowed himself to be anguished, to be distressed, to grieve, to experience loss, to say, I need my friends in this moment. And if Jesus did, how much more do we need to? Let's pray together.